I've had my fair share of issues with pre-built gaming PCs over the years, but nothing like this system right here. See, manufacturers like CyberPower, iBuyPower, Dell, Lenovo, and HP typically rip off customers by overcharging for the hardware inside of the system, or just have a very poorly designed system due to them cheaping out on things like the case, power supply, and cooling solution. But they aren't downright scamming consumers like ViprTech is. See, I was on the hunt for a decent pre-built gaming PC to test out around the $500 to $700 range when I came across their listing for this particular system, with ViprTech's calling their Mutineer gaming PC in white. And on paper, this system sounds like a pretty good deal because it comes with an Intel Core i7, 16GB of RAM, and a 512GB SSD, and a GT 1660 Super, which if that's true would mean this is an absolute steal for about $525. But when something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, which is exactly the case with this system right here. Because when you start to read the description a little further about the system specs, they never say what i7 is actually inside the system, just that it was a quad core at 3.8 GHz. Well, if you think about that, that should be a red flag right away, because when was the last time that Intel made a desktop i7 with 4 cores? Well, it turns out it was 7 years ago for the 7th generation i7-7700. But that CPU didn't even run at 3.8 GHz either. So what exactly is inside the system? Well, it turns out they put an Intel Core i7-2600 in here all the way back from 2011 in a system that they're selling brand new right now on Amazon. And because I was really curious about what was going on here, I actually gave ViprTech a call. Actually, I had to give them about 5 calls to finally get through, but once I did, I was able to actually talk to one of their service reps. And it turns out after talking to them, they admitted that they do use used hardware in their computers.
Some of our processors we do have new, some of them we do get refurbished and certified.
But the crazy part is they don't mention that anywhere on their website, and even on the website where they do say that it happens to be a 2600 in their Mutineer systems, they don't say anything about that processor being used, which is just so deceptive to consumers. And if you dive a little deeper on like the Amazon listing like I mentioned, they don't say anything regarding what processors even in the system, let alone that this system is actually used. And just passing it off as new just makes this a total scam. And the crazy part is, that's not even the only weird choice about this system either. Because when was the last time you saw an unmarked GPU or motherboard with no branding on it? Well, it just doesn't happen. Those manufacturers like to share off their brand, and yeah, that's what's going on here. Because the ones inside here are completely unmarked, besides a single ViprTech sticker on the back of the GPU, which looks like it was made with a homemade label printer, and the motherboard seems to have a model number on the back, which when I looked it up, seemed to go absolutely nowhere. But after doing a little digging in the BIOS, I was able to figure out that this is an old B75 chipset board that likely was made a lot newer than the CPU because of the inclusion of an M.2 slot, which didn't even exist when this chipset was released, nor did it even come with support for NVMe drives. So how does the SSD in the system even work? Well, it's because you can actually mod the BIOS of old chipsets to steal lanes from the PCI Express slot for the GPU to make that drive compatible with the system. What this mod does is that it takes the PCIe Gen 2 16X slot and turns it into an 8X slot because the CPU only supports 16 PCIe lanes, making the GPU run at a lower bandwidth than it was actually manufactured to, thus bottlenecking the GPU even more than the CPU is already going to do. And speaking of the SSD, the drive itself was one of the only items in the system that was easy to identify because it was made by Mushkin, a pretty cheap manufacturer of SSDs and memory modules who aren't really known for the best reliability. And something that I noticed that was a little weird with this SSD is that it looks like it's been powered on and off extensively before arriving here, because it had powered on well over 100 times before showing up here, at least according to the smart data. If they were using this for testing purposes, that's perfectly fine, but it does seem a little excessive. And all the hardware inside this system is being powered by one of the sketchiest power supplies I've ever seen. It's marked as a 550 watt ViprTech model that isn't 80 plus rated, and it feels so light, I just don't even believe the power claims. All of this gets housed in what appears to be a knockoff Montech X1, which was never known for being a great case, just cheap. And that's really what this case is. It's very cheap, and you could pretty much feel that this is like a $40 case. So really nothing special here. The only nice thing is it does come with 4 RGB fans that are controlled by a little switch up top. They are not ARGB or digital RGB, meaning you can't control them by your motherboard, so that is a limitation as well. Now let's go ahead and talk about the assembly quality, because that's something that they can definitely control as a manufacturer. And honestly, it isn't terrible. Things like the cable management weren't bad at all. They kept everything very well tied down with zip ties, and they did a good job in a tight case, especially when you have the RGB fans up front, which do put a lot of extra cables in the system that you don't want to have to manage. The only issue I did have with the cable management though was how they ran the PCIe cable, as they have it with a 180-degree bend, which does put a lot of stress on not only the cable but also the card itself, which isn't necessary and something I probably would change if I was Vipertech, because the last thing you want is one of your customers buying a gaming PC to end up having a broken GPU because of your bad cable management. The quality concerns continue with things like a missing PCIe cover on the back of the case, which isn't the end of the world, but it does feel like they could have spent the extra 10 seconds and a couple pennies to cover that up like any other manufacturer would. Also, the screws on the CPU cooler also looked like they were partially stripped, or at least close enough where if I went to go ahead and repaste the CPU, I might just put them over the edge. This is just poor assembly quality. That might just be a one-off, but I just don't like seeing this stuff, in a new PC. It should be perfect, and that's really what I was expecting out of a system like this. Now let's go ahead and talk about the overall experience I had using this PC, because that wasn't great either. Because the second I fired the system up, it was already logged into a local user account without me being able to log into my Microsoft account or set up any kinds of passwords, which is always a little bit of a concern because you never know what kind of malicious software could have been easily slipped into that pre-installed operating system. Just look at what Ace Magic was doing a while back. Yeah, that stuff was pretty sketchy. Fortunately, this system was clean, but it wasn't without some weird things. Like the fact that despite having an Intel CPU and NVIDIA GPU, they had AMD's Radeon graphics driver software running on the machine. So what I assume that they're doing is that they have one install for all their systems, and they're cloning that install to all the drives and loading the drivers for NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD on all the systems, which I don't think is a great idea just because sometimes having those drivers can conflict with each other, causing issues for the end user, and is something that could easily be fixed. What also was a little odd about this system was that because the system's motherboard didn't have built-in Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, they sent over two separate USB cards, including a Wi-Fi card that seems to be a single band card that could only connect to 2.4 GHz networks, thus limiting my gigabit network to 35 megabits per second. And the Bluetooth card, that was okay, but it was old because this is definitely a Bluetooth 4.0 card, which I guess is fine, but these are really not that expensive items. They could have definitely given us the latest standards, allowing us to connect at fast speeds. Just feels like ViprTech was being cheap here. Honestly, it's not the end of the world because you can connect over Ethernet, but yeah, just step that up a little bit. And this just feels like the main theme of the entire system. It's cheap. All around, from the Wi-Fi card to the CPU and power supply, a cheap PC like this results in poor performance. So poor, in fact, that their own website admits that this system can't run any modern game at 60 frames per second at 1080p, even on low. That is super disappointing because even a modern APU build these days can reach those stats. So yeah, I probably wouldn't buy this for gaming. With that said, should you buy a PC from ViprTech? Well, I'd say absolutely not. They only seem to be selling these older systems with varying degrees of last or multiple generation back CPUs with some very questionable origins. And when I reached out to their support staff to see if I could get some details on what was going on, they admitted on the phone that they were using used CPUs in some of their systems.
Some of our processors we do have new, some of them we do get refurbished and certified.
And although they do claim that they're all tested, it just feels very sketchy, particularly when they go on their website and at least there they do admit what CPU's in there. They don't say anything about using used hardware, nor do they say anywhere in their FAQ page or about page or anything like that. And then if you dive a little deeper and you go on their Amazon page, they don't say anything about the processor, just that it's an i7, which is so deceptive because people might be thinking that they're getting an amazing deal, like what I thought I was, and then all of a sudden they're buying a system with a CPU that was probably in another computer for 10 plus years. That's just very deceptive, and for a lot of people, yeah, it just stay away from these systems. They're not great. And if they do clean up this practice in the future, I may recommend them as an option for like an ultra budget rig if they drop the prices a little bit. But for right now, yeah, just stay away from them. They're not great, and you can definitely find something a lot better. And if you are looking for a current system right now, I'll have some better pre-built systems linked down below from some better brands. At least they're going to be using, new hardware and are going to be built a little better as well. And I'll even have a full parts list if you want to go ahead and build your own PC, which is always my recommendation just because you're going to always get your best bang for the buck. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like, subscribe for more content like this. Take a look at this video here where he investigated Ace Magic and some of the incredibly deceptive practices that they were using. They actually loaded malware on PCs a while back, which is pretty crazy.